faithfully sharing value and exploring great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally Talks Books. Today, we're discussing Montesquieu's masterpiece, The Causes of the Greatness and Decline of the Romans. Oh, this isn't just a history of Rome, it's a theoretical work. He digs into the deep reasons behind ancient Rome's political wins and losses, giving modern leaders fresh ideas for governance. Ancient Rome? Yeah, it's a landmark of Western civilization. Started as a tiny, obscure city-state in central Italy, then gradually conquered the Italian peninsula. By 146 BC, Roman legions marched beyond Italy, destroying Carthage in North Africa and Corinth in Greece, dominating the Mediterranean. Its unique republican system also became well known. With military expansion, Rome's ruling style changed. The republic became an empire. Starting in 27 BC, the empire ruled the entire Mediterranean region for 500 years. Later, after various internal and external troubles, it finally fell in 476 AD. How did Rome grow from a tiny Italian town to a super empire spanning Asia, Africa, and Europe? And how did it crumble from that height? What's really behind these ups and downs? Just like how folks in China enjoy chatting about dynasties' glory and doom. Oh, Westerners dig these questions too. Montesquieu in the 1700s was totally hooked. Montesquieu came from a French noble family, got a top-notch education, and even served as a court president. Plus, he was pals with Enlightenment thinkers, sure that science could fix human woes. But hold on, this science isn't like chemistry or physics, it's about politics. It's about finding the rules and how laws and governments evolve to make society better. With that goal, he penned The Causes of the Greatness and Decline of the Romans. In the book, he diagnoses Rome's history. In a nutshell, Rome thrived thanks to bold military expansion and a government that matched those ambitions. And its downfall? Yep, all that winning at war spoiled people's minds and wrecked the political balance. All right, let's dive into this book and see how Montesquieu arrived at this conclusion. Analytically speaking, Montesquieu approached the study of Roman polity from two angles. First is the national spirit, which is a certain ethos that sustains a nation's unique character. For example, we might say Germans are meticulous in their work, while French folks are naturally romantic. In fact, national spirit often boils down to specific customs and habits. Second is the political system, which refers to the design of the political framework, whether it's a monarchy, aristocracy, or a democratic republic. So, what's the relationship between national spirit and political systems? In Montesquieu's view, national spirit dominates the establishment of political systems. If the national spirit changes, the political system will adapt accordingly. The Romans, their national spirit was all about warfare, constantly seeking expansion, truly a warrior nation. When Rome was just a small tribe by the Tiber River facing harsh living conditions, they had two choices: either intensive farming, develop peacefully into an agricultural nation, or survive by plundering other tribes' grain, livestock, and land, embarking on a path of external expansion. With threats all around, the Romans ultimately chose the second path. And so, Europe's most famous war machine was set in motion. Romans had various customs that perfectly reflected their national character. First, all Romans were soldiers. All adult male citizens of Rome had to serve as soldiers. Military service was both a basic obligation and a privilege reserved for Roman citizens. Although Rome was a city, its initial purpose was to store spoils of war. Romans spent their daily energy on physical training, improving weapons, and strategizing warfare. Even dancing and music were part of military training. As for crafting artifacts or doing business, those were tasks for people of low status. Second, Romans relied on war plunder to sustain their livelihood. The Romans lacked conditions for farming and weren't good at business, so their income depended entirely on war plunder. But they stipulated that captured spoils were distributed collectively. Even generals couldn't take an extra share. Romans were very faithful to their promises. Strict enforcement of this distribution rule fostered a social atmosphere of equality for all. As a result, on one hand, Romans had to constantly wage wars abroad to make a living and gain spoils. On the other hand, living mostly military lives, they embraced simplicity, valuing honor far above wealth. Thirdly, Rome's elite class also eagerly initiated wars. Consuls came to power through elections and faced re-election every year. To showcase achievements for re-election, consuls constantly proposed wars to the people and reminded the Senate that triumphant returns from new battlefields naturally polished their resumes. On the other hand, the Senate, composed of nobles, also favored launching wars. This way, commoners wouldn't complain about social inequalities, redirecting conflicts abroad. Combined, these factors cultivated Romans' character, loving the collective, eager in public affairs. Since citizens were Rome's backbone, the republic best suited their temperament. In Latin, republic means public affairs. The republic's essence was citizens prioritizing collective matters above all. Early Rome had monarchy, where politics belonged to kings. Later, external wars relied on citizens, boosting commoners' influence. Eventually, Romans exiled their king, establishing republican governance much earlier than other nations. Conversely, Rome's republican system fueled its early territorial expansion. Montesquieu cited two examples showing how Rome's republic crucially enabled its military rise. First, Rome's wars against Carthage. Second, conflicts with Eastern Mediterranean monarchies. Consider Rome's Great War with Carthage, a North African commercial powerhouse and Rome's chief rival during its ascent. They fought three major wars, with the second being most pivotal. Carthage had military genius Hannibal, who nearly annihilated Rome's army in southeast Italy against overwhelming odds. But Montesquieu noted it was institutional strength that saved Rome. The Romans cherished honor above life itself. With enemies on Roman soil, they fought relentlessly, refusing any truce. The Senate rejected prisoner ransoms, regrouped forces for defense. Meanwhile, trade-based Carthage had every class pursuing self-interest, wavering in war one moment, urging Hannibal to advance, the next to retreat. The Carthaginian mercenaries refused to fight anymore after a major victory. Thus, Romans who prioritized collective interests kept winning brilliant battles against overwhelming odds and ultimately won the war. As for Rome's confrontation with the Eastern Mediterranean monarchies, it was essentially a clash between republicanism and ancient monarchy. These monarchies were legacies of Alexander the Great, established by his successors. Since monarchs only cared about their rule and pleasures, oppressed commoners rebelled during wars, and rampant extravagance meant their military discipline and training couldn't match Rome's. Ultimately, Rome defeated these monarchies without doubt, becoming the Mediterranean hegemon, just like the Chinese saying, secure the internal before dealing with the external. Rome's success in foreign conquests surely depended on a good domestic political environment. However, Romans accustomed to military life were all hot-tempered. Montesquieu said, "The Roman Republic was a boiling volcano. Add one more thing, and it would erupt." Interestingly, this fiery group of Romans built a state without conflicts that could tear it apart. The secret lay in three forces within the political system that balanced each other. So, what exactly are these three forces? The first force is the nobility. After the king was exiled, the republic established consuls. Initially, consuls were appointed from leaders of prominent families. Influential families divided the powers and honors left by the king, passing them down through generations, creating hereditary nobility. In the Roman Republic system design, the Senate represented the noble faction. Roman nobles were characterized by steadiness, authority, and reverence for ancient customs. Besides monopolizing power through status, They obstructed the citizen assemblies convening in various ways. And the second force is the commoners, masses without noble backgrounds. The king's expulsion ignited their love for freedom, but the revolution's outcomes shifted entirely to the noble consuls. Thus, commoners confronted nobles head-on and elected tribunes. This position represented their interests, and commoners could convene the citizen assembly, make laws, exile disliked individuals through voting, and even refuse military service to balance against nobles. The third force is the censor. Because political struggles between commoners and nobles were too intense, often disrupting the republic's operation, and if prolonged, could tear the nation apart, a mediating force was needed to balance them: the censor. First, censors held no direct political power, but they could review senators' qualifications, confirm the status of lower nobles, equestrians, and even remove nobles from the Senate when necessary. Second, they were responsible for investigating moral decay within the republic. Finally, censors oversaw dividing commoners' voting districts to prevent tribunes from prolonged terms, thus blocking potential usurpers. Through this tripartite balance, Rome's political system effectively prevented power abuse. In Montesquieu's view, this was precisely why Rome thrived: a military republic that stayed vibrant yet stable, outperforming other nations. Let's recap. Rome's rise stemmed first from its martial customs and warlike national character, the foundation of its entire institutional framework. Second, the republic's checks and balances ensured domestic stability, freeing Rome to focus on external conquest. But if Romans had both the warrior spirit and matching political system, why did they decline? Montesquieu pinpointed it. Rome's downfall came precisely because it achieved dominance too early and too rapidly. Through relentless campaigns, Rome conquered peoples across Asia, Africa, and Europe, ruling the entire Mediterranean world. Yet, who could have imagined this superpower would ultimately crumble before Germanic tribes? Of course, just as Rome wasn't built overnight, its fall wasn't sudden either. So how did Rome gradually decline? Again, Montesquieu analyzed it through two lenses. From the national spirit perspective, Romans' republican ethos disintegrated over time. From the political structure angle, the system of checks and balances collapsed. First, consider the decline in national spirit. Originally just a small Italian town, Rome's expanding empire required more troops stationed abroad, escalating the cost of maintaining control. Gradually, soldiers stationed far from Rome lost their homeland attachment, obeying local generals over Rome's commands. Thus, the Romans' republican spirit and patriotic fervor slowly faded. Secondly, multicultural impacts fractured Rome itself. As imperial capital, Rome drew diverse peoples who brought conflicting customs, philosophies, and religions that violently clashed with Roman traditions. Rome's warlike ethos, unity, and patriotic zeal began vanishing. Meanwhile, immigrant groups formed rival political factions within Rome, tearing its political fabric apart daily. Thirdly, Romans were corrupted by wealth. As a global empire, Rome seized lands and extracted endless tribute wealth from conquered nations. Montesquieu observed this mirrored Spain's New World plunder. Rome similarly drained riches from new territories. Luxury spread nationwide. Romans abandoned simplicity for greed. The rich squandered into poverty while the poor gambled for sudden riches. Worse, money's growing political influence normalized bribery. This was catastrophic. In Rome's participatory republic, political corruption meant citizens' moral decay. Fourthly, the warrior nation grew averse to war, indulging in pleasures, neglecting training, with soldiers refusing to die for Rome, hiring foreign mercenaries instead. Early Roman armies used foreigners sparingly, only in auxiliary roles, but late Rome's military backbone became barbarian mercenaries. Moreover, Romans bought peace with gold. Facing barbarian invasions, they appeased with payments rather than fighting. feeling no shame. Thus, amid these cultural shifts, the Roman Republic transformed into a dictatorial empire. A key sign was how individual politicians grew increasingly prominent in Roman politics. Dictatorship began taking shape during the Triumvirate era. Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey, names you all know well. Before their rule, officials rotated frequently. People barely knew or cared about their leaders. But under the triumvirate, politicians' personal charisma became overpowering. These politicians came from nobility or military ranks, crucially using wealth to buy public support. For instance, they bribed voters during consul elections and rewarded supporters afterward, making citizens delegate politics to elites rather than participate. With this groundwork, Caesar's heir Octavian easily established dictatorship during his reign. Senators and commoners traded power for lasting peace, handing all authority to Octavian. He became princeps, first senator, while holding consular and tribunician powers. Thus, Rome's once balanced power centers merged, enabling unchecked abuses that bred tyrants like Nero. The worst outcome of Rome's shift to dictatorship? Chronic instability rooted in military dependence. Roman dictators bought army loyalty with material benefits. Emperors paid soldiers from state coffers, granting lands without combat. Rome's golden age, the Antonine dynasty, saw multiple military emperors adopting generals as heirs for smooth succession, but armies that crown emperors can also dethrone them. Post-Antonine, emperors routinely fell to mutinies or generals seizing power, yet bribing soldiers drained treasuries, unsustainable long-term. With military interference rampant and emperors insecure, reforms finally began. There was an emperor named Diocletian who claimed state affairs were overwhelming, so he appointed several generals to assist in governance. So he divided the empire's army into 4 parts, letting them balance each other out. Later, Emperor Constantine made the commanders of the Praetorian Guard focus solely on administrative work, forbade them from meddling in military affairs, and increased their number from 2 to 4. Through these reforms that decentralized power, emperors finally escaped the threat from the army, but it also distanced them from military activities, weakening the empire's potential for progress. Emperors became indulgent in pleasures and cowardly, preferring to deal with court ministers, unwilling to manage imperial military affairs. They only listened to their close confidants. So power fell into the hands of a few favorites. Roman ministers and generals had to act according to the whims of these people with no rules to speak of. During its rise, Rome once defeated the monarchies of the East, but by this time, Roman emperors lived like the Persian kings of the East, indulging in luxury and pomp while demanding worship from their subjects. Thus, Rome's political atmosphere deteriorated day by day. To summarize, after Rome's republican system turned dictatorial, state power concentrated in the hands of dictators, and the people began distancing themselves from politics. The Roman army brought political instability, and court politics exacerbated the abuse of power. To strengthen effective control, the Roman Empire later had to be divided into 2 halves, the so-called Eastern and Western Roman empires. The Western Roman Empire later fell due to barbarian invasions, while the Eastern Roman Empire retreated to a corner, barely surviving, no longer worthy of the name Rome. In the opening of this book, on the causes of Rome's rise and fall, I mentioned that Montesquieu studied Rome to derive a scientific view of the political world. So through this book, what political science conclusions did Montesquieu uncover? First, although the political stage may seem full of accidental events, analysis can delve into deep causes like political structures and national character. For example, when observing Rome's rise and fall, one shouldn't just focus on individual military leaders or politicians, but see Rome's fundamental policy of military foundation. A republic with simple customs and universal military service easily achieved rise, that once the nation became powerful and stopped waging wars, the national character transformed. Thus, the nation's power inevitably declined. Second, Montesquieu initially proposed the idea of checks and balances. The strength of Rome's republican government lay in the mutual checks among its internal forces, which prevented power abuse while keeping citizens active, achieving harmony through political struggle. In his other book, The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu put forward the famous theory of separation of powers and checks and balances, drawing inspiration directly from the Roman Republic. Third, Montesquieu reinterpreted Roman history. History repeatedly points out the dangers of the path of military expansion. In 17th century Europe, the old political order declined under the impacts of the Reformation, Renaissance, and Age of Discovery. So, how did a new political order emerge? What path should a nation's rise take? Should it pursue a military empire path or opt for a commercial empire model? Should it choose absolute monarchy or a people's republic system? Through the causes of the greatness and decline of the Romans, Montesquieu aimed to show that Rome's path cannot be replicated and that the military empire route is unsustainable. In modern society, following a commercial empire path like Britain's is the right choice. Well, that's the causes of the greatness and decline of the Romans. That concludes our interpretation of this book.